Now, honourable members, that concludes the statement. I would just like to go back to the point as raised by Mr Callister. This is a statement, therefore questions can be asked of the Minister. In terms of misleading the court, that needs to come back at a later date by a substantive motion. And the issue with regards to disclosing documents, the member needs to apply to the Standards Committee for permission. No,
President, members. Order. I didn't hear the honourable member accuse me of misleading the court. I apologise for. I was more focused on the content rather than any spurious allegations he may have made. But I would like to place on record a request for the honourable member to withdraw those remarks in accordance with standing orders.
Honourable member, Mr Callister, you wish to?
Happy to remove them, Mr President. I think the member's already thrown me under the political bus, so it's fine.
No, honourable members. I have been given written notice by Chief Minister of a motion for immediate discussion of a definite matter of urgent public importance. I must now follow procedure in Standing Order 2.8. First, I need to know if Chief Minister has support of 4 other members rising. If you wish to support Chief Minister, please stand. Thank you, honourable members. Please be seated. Like I say, Chief Minister has sufficient support. The next stage is to find out if the court gives leave for this matter to be discussed immediately. So I'll now call that question. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call on Hayward, Chief Minister, to move.
Mr President, last week I made a statement in the House of Keys following the conclusion of the remedy hearing of the Employment and Equality Tribunal considering the Dr Ranson Tribunal case. I felt that it was in the national interest to address the matters initially identified during the liability hearing of the case in May 2022, but brought again to the fore by the publication of the Tribunal's quantum decision. I also felt that it was important to offer a public apology to Dr Ranson for the harm that she had experienced, and for the benefit of this court, I can confirm that I have followed this up in writing to Dr Ranson. To remind honourable members, following the findings of the liability hearing in May 2022, I acknowledged in this court that the ruling made uncomfortable reading, and that regrettably it did not reflect well on the professionalism of the public service. The liability decision found comprehensively in favour of Dr Ranson, determining that she had been unfairly dismissed. The decision brought to light some very concerning detrimental behaviour, largely on the part of Ms Magson, but also to a lesser extent other employees of the Department of Health and Social Care and indeed in government. I acknowledged in May 2022 that we needed to make changes to government, structural changes, cultural changes and organisational changes. I said then that such changes would not happen overnight, but I laid the foundations for change and made an undertaking to start and to move with urgency. That work started immediately in May 2022 and progress continues. Last week in the House of Keys, I set out 3 distinct arms of our strategic response to the findings of the Tribunal. Firstly, that the COVID review, chaired by Kate Brunner KC, is a forum for an independent examination of the impact that any suppression of information from Dr Ranson may have had, and potentially how these types of conflicts may be avoided in the future in any national emergency. As was made clear in the terms of reference for that review, Kate Brunner KC is conducting the inquiry in her own manner. I do not intend to say anything more on this matter, except that I can confirm that Kate Brunner has acknowledged her awareness of this matter as highlighted in the Tribunal's final judgment. Secondly, and I repeat what I said last week, we must ensure that our public service works to the highest standards of governance and integrity. We must have governance that ensures we do not rely solely on single individuals at senior levels to such a degree where they could become a point of failure. All our public servants are entitled to a working environment where accountability and mutual respect coexist. I set out a clear Council of Ministers response to improve governance and culture last year, and we remain committed to improving governance and culture throughout the public sector. Indeed, I set out in the House of Keys last week a full response to tackling this issue. I do not intend to dwell further on that today. Thirdly, as I said last week, it is vital that the public have confidence in the manner in which government conducts itself when facing judicial challenge. It must have confidence that government is conducting itself properly and with the appropriate advice and decision-making. It is that matter which I ask the Court of Tynwald to consider today. Mr. President, there have been a significant number of allegations made during the course of the liability hearing, some of which have been proven and some of which were not substantiated. In addition, there have been a number of serious allegations and inferences made by individuals outside of the tribunal process and repeated widely on social media and in the mainstream press, which have led to some serious public concerns. These must be addressed. In highlighting these concerns, however, I must, Mr. President, stick to the facts, and the arbiter of those facts in this case, Mr. President, was the Employment Tribunal. I therefore seek to quote directly from the tribunal findings. In paragraph 351 of the recent Quantum decision, and I quote, "The tribunal considered that the liability proceedings were conducted unreasonably and involved a false allegation, brackets, and indeed more than one, close brackets." Similarly, at paragraph 354 of the Quantum decision, the tribunal said that in looking at the whole picture of the conduct of the liability proceedings, undoubtedly there were serious shortcomings. Documents were being disclosed before, during, and even after the close of evidence, some of them very material and deliberately withheld. That aspect is part of the whole picture, but there were other much more serious elements that underpin the tribunal's decision to award costs to Dr Ranson. Unquote. Mr. President, having made these findings 12 months ago and having summarised the conclusions in the recent decision at paragraphs 363 and 364, the tribunal went on to say that, and I quote again, "Taking the whole picture into account, the tribunal has determined that the DHSC must bear a proportion of the costs incurred by Dr Ranson of the liability proceedings. It is understandable, but not excusable, for an unrepresented litigant from a small business to defend his position in this tribunal in what proves to be an indefensible manner and probably not to be ordered to pay costs. It is, however, inexcusable for a chief executive such as Miss Magson to mislead both the tribunal and Dr Ranson. The case on liability was fought tooth and nail by the DHSC on a false basis to the substantial detriment of Dr Ranson and at the expense of taxpayers on the Isle of Man. Miss Magson knew that the denials of liability in the response contained assertions and allegations that were untrue. She knew or should have known and understood that the way she had drafted the response was unsustainable. She knew or should have known that her pleaded arguments could never survive scrutiny once the documents which needed to be revealed were in fact disclosed." Unquote. Mr. President, these and other matters need to be understood, the reasons for such statements by the tribunal examined, the reasonableness or otherwise of the actions of individuals assessed, and appropriate action or recommendations undertaken. In doing so, I wish to add, again for the purposes of fact, Mr. President, that the same level of criticism that was levelled at the DHSC in relation to the liability proceedings was not evident in the Quantum decision. Paragraph 376 of that decision stated, that the Tribunal would like to place on record their appreciation of the diligent input from both leading counsel as supported by their respective legal teams. The spirit of cooperation on administrative issues has led to the orderly process of the remedy hearing with the documentation in excellent order." Unquote. Nevertheless, Mr. President, despite the Tribunal citing no issues in respect of the handling of the remedy proceedings, it is quite clear that some spectators, and indeed some honourable members, have expressed concerns that improper conduct has taken place and that decisions have been taken to harm Dr Ranson. These are serious matters, and whilst these allegations are not accepted, I consider that if this motion is supported today, those honourable members and others who continue to have any such concerns will have the opportunity to explain fully those concerns to a retired High Court judge or similar. Mr. President, that is why the motion today explicitly sets out that a review should examine those areas of concern identified by the Tribunal and should include an examination of the interaction between the Department of Health and Social Care, the Attorney General's chambers, independent legal advisers and the Cabinet Office during the full course of the Tribunal. The review should also consider those areas of concern relating to the conduct of the Department of Health and Social Care highlighted by the Employment and Equality Tribunal in the liability judgment, as well as the conduct of the Isle of Man Government during the litigation process. It is therefore today, Mr. President, Council's recommendation that a Tynwald Select Committee be established to appoint either a retired English High Court judge or King's Counsel or a person of similar standing to undertake the review. The Select Committee will also be tasked with drafting the terms of reference and subsequently reviewing those terms with the person appointed to undertake the review. It is important, Mr. President, that the review is undertaken in a timely manner so that any resulting recommendations can be implemented as a matter of urgency. It is therefore our recommendation that the report from the independent review, if supported, be laid before the December 2023 sitting of Tynwald. Mr. President, I beg to move.
On the honourable member, Ms Bill Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
On the honourable member, Mr Glover.
Gurumai, Dr Ren. I've just sat back and watched in amazement so far today. It's 18 months since the general election. Ahead of it, people told me to get on in the Isle of Man. It's all about who you know, and you won't break the government machine. Sadly, and based on what I now know, there's more than a grain of truth to that. This whole saga illustrates what's wrong here. In all the commentary, somebody said government departments act like a government within government, and I believe that is correct. It's the system that's broken. It's more than just this terribly damaging case. I wrote to the Chief Minister last Wednesday, ahead of Council of Ministers meeting the next day out of courtesy, expressing my serious concerns that a narrow assessment of one department was not going to cut the mustard, so I do welcome that it is wider. Mr. President, we were able to question the statements he made in another place the day before when he announced the assessment. In answer to a question from the member for Russian, Dr Hayward, about how many other similar situations were in play across government, the Chief Minister quite rightly mentioned people being exposed to nefarious behaviour need to be treated properly and fairly. Let me just remind members of what nefarious behaviour is defined as, with synonyms from the dictionary. It can mean in alphabetical order: bad, dark, evil, immoral, iniquitous, rotten, sinful, unethical, unlawful, unrighteous, unsavoury, vicious, vile, villainous, wicked and wrong. Mr. President, since yesterday's announcement of this urgent motion, which the language is upgraded now to an independent review rather than assessment, Tynwald members and the media have been contacted by other whistleblowers. This just illustrates how little in reality this review really can achieve and why it needs to be bigger and braver in approach. When written to last year by one of the whistleblowers, the Chief Minister ended his eventual reply with, "I do not intend to correspond further with you on this matter." That happened last August. Is that the language that will instill trust in this process? I personally don't think so. In fact, language is key. Mr. President, the job advert issued earlier this year for a new external relations boss contained in it the words, "to protect the Isle of Man's image," or words to that effect. Really protect? Surely not promote. Before moving on, it has to be said the vast majority of our government workers, Mr. President, work hard and diligently. They should be thanked, and they should be able to signal wrongdoing in a safe and legal way. However, because of a few bad apples, it's across government, and that's why, to me, the review, and I welcome its broader range to include government behaviour and the role of the Attorney General's chambers in this sorry saga, for example, will still be seen to be trying to put out the raging fire with a water pistol. Remember the statement from Dr Ranson herself at the end of this process. Wrongdoing has gone unchallenged. Harm has occurred, not just to me, but to others, and I believe there is avoidable loss of life. It doesn't get more serious than that. Some players are still in key top-level jobs. Rather than a not very convincing review, why not call for a UK-led commission of investigation, or simply invite the police in to investigate? Both are cheaper and quicker alternatives, which will root out any wrongdoing and not just protect the Isle of Man's image, it will actually restore it. Mr. President, public trust in our current government from the top down is fractured. The toughest job interview I had before standing for election was conducted by Colin Jones at Barclay Trust. I was recently divorced, had resigned from a finance job after only a few months, and was working in the kitchen at the Groudle pub. He said, "Why should I employ you? You seem to have no stickability." I answered, "I'm not prepared to settle for second best." I got the job based on that answer. Believe me, I still have plenty of stickability, and I'm still not prepared to settle for second best. Mr. President, doing nothing, or the bare minimum is not enough here. Doing nothing when in full knowledge of what was at play is not good enough. Carrying out orders is no defence. I met with Dr Ranson on Saturday afternoon. She could only trust 3 politicians to meet with her. Ask yourselves, do you remember that? Trust. What I saw was truly shocking and terribly upsetting. Dr Ranson does not want the tribunal to be the end. We must honour that. It must not be the end, and I am grateful the Chief Minister has expressed those very sentiments earlier in the other place. Until this is honoured, I want nothing to do with the current administration, as I don't have confidence that they have grasped just how big this is and how essential it is for this administration to have any chance of success and fully implement its island plan. My challenge, therefore, is prove me wrong, and I hope you do. I really do. I hope you do. I passed a handwritten letter to the Infrastructure Minister as I stood up to speak, and I will write later to the Chief Minister to resign as a department member. We have to and must do better. People need to be accountable, Mr. President. The full power of the state must never be used to destroy someone and their career ever again. Let's face it, we haven't even got the apology right here. Sorry does seem to be the hardest word to say. It was done in a handwritten letter to advocates, not directly to Dr Ranson. Thank you, Mr. President.
Go on, the Honourable Member for Garth. Yes, Lordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to have some sympathy with the
comments of the previous speaker, but I don't entirely share that incredibly bleak view of our public service. There are very many good people, but the system was broken, and that has been acknowledged and must be further acknowledged. I can see the reasoning behind the Chief Minister's motion before us today, and I broadly support it. But given all the comments that have been made, particularly in relation to the previous Chief Executive of the Department for Health and Social Care, Ms Magson, describing particular actions, deliberately withholding information and a certain maliciousness in her treatment of Dr Ranson, where is the accountability going to be? Will the Chief Minister's review, independent through a retired High Court judge or senior legal professional, how will that review restore public confidence in this government and the public administration on the Isle of Man? How can they have confidence? Will this review have any power to require or compel the attendance of all the people necessary to gather the information and make a thorough inquiry? And would a public inquiry, in fact, have any greater powers to enable that to happen? Because that seems to be the missing piece in all of this. So I would say to the Chief Minister, I see where he's coming from and what he's hoping to achieve, but there is so much horror on the island for what has been carried out in the name of the people through the public administration, through a time of COVID, and for a tribunal and statements to suggest that lives could have been saved. There can be no more serious event that we are facing, and it comes at a time of the Chief Minister's government. So for me, it's not about protecting or restoring the Isle of Man's image. It's about restoring confidence in the Isle of Man's reputation. But it's vital the public can have a confidence with transparency and accountability as a result of any review. Can the Chief Minister give me the reassurance and this honourable court that his motion will achieve that? Thank you, Mr. President.
Go on, the honourable member, Mr. Wonnacott.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I could just give a quote by Desmond Tutu, who said the following: "I wish I could shut up, but I can't, and I won't." And the more I hear about this Ranson case, the more I resonate with that sentiment. I do not wish to be part of a witch hunt. That would be simply to replicate the behaviour that has brought us here today. So I recognise the government has acted decisively and that a number of key players are no longer around. They have left with a full payoff and pension. That is a bitter pill to swallow. Additionally, if there is no redress on departed characters, then the public deserve to know the terms that they were paid off in. A question must be asked about the complete and utter failure by the previous Chief Minister and his executive as to why they failed clearly and effectively to grasp this important and fundamental and effect real change throughout government machine, not just the HSC. Perhaps those members of that executive who are sitting here today can explain why more wasn't done to address culture at that time. I will give credit to this Chief Minister in that at the very least he has recognised the problem and he is addressing it. I recognise the magnitude of the task, the scale of the change required, and note it will take a lot of time. But more than anything else, it will require the real will to get the change and accountability that we need to restore trust. There has been a seismic shift in the public opinion of this administration, from the optimism that swept them in 20 months ago. We are a third way through this Parliament, but we have it all to do. Needless to say, I'm deeply disturbed by the unfolding saga from the Employment Tribunal hearing of Dr Ranson's unfair dismissal. Not just the revelations of the connivance of the DHSC and its senior management, not just the costs and remedy involved, not just the damning statements from Professor Philip Banfield, as if any of those aspects are themselves not deeply troubling. The tribunal laid bare that Dr Ranson was marginalised because she spoke truth to power. Dr Ranson was humiliated and bullied, because she spoke truth to power. Dr. Ranson has had her reputation trashed, all because she spoke truth to power. These are undisputable facts. In reality, all she wanted to do was her job, to protect this island and its residents in a global pandemic. As I alluded to earlier, I recognize that much of the scandalous injustice meted out to Dr. Ranson took place in the previous House, yet the appeals were lodged during the tenure of this House by people sitting in this chamber today. The appeals lodged meant that the government machine was not yet done. A vindictive pursuit continued, irrespective of the merit of the appeals or the cost to the taxpayer, and regardless of the well-being of Dr. Ranson. I doubt that Dr. Ranson felt like a prized asset. What I would say to Dr. Ranson is this: these misguided appeals were not carried out in my name, nor in the name of the people that I represent. They were at the behest of a savage out-for-revenge system that sought to smear Dr. Ranson, and it is highly questionable whether they should ever have been brought. This island relies on trust and confidence, and it is important to hold individuals who have acted so contrary to the principles of public office to account. The findings of this landmark tribunal besmirches this island and every single person living here. This isn't just about the Ranson case. It's about the relationship between government and its citizens. It's about what this finding does to that relationship. When the government machine turns on one of its own, it turns. And when it turns in a brutal manner that these findings have established, it is hell-bent on destroying the individual, which confirms that we are losing sight of humanity. Mr. President, another esteemed South African, the late Nelson Mandela, said, "It is always impossible until it is done." And I would hope that it is done for Dr. Ranson. She has suffered long enough, and I, for one, offer my personal apologies. And I too met with her last week. The tribunals have vindicated her, and history will judge her rightfully. In closing, I would simply say this: to all those that sought to ruin the reputation of Dr. Ranson with their connivance, their silence, or their lies, they must now prepare to have their own reputations ruined by the truth. Thank you.
Calling the Honourable Member, Mr Crookall.
Thank you, Mr President. Just a couple of points of clarification from the Chief Minister, if I can, on his motion of public importance. On point one, and I think he actually made this point in his statement, but I would like to clarify that this independent review will include anybody that had anything to do with this case. And the second point is on point two, that he's, and I'll read his minutes here, the terms of reference for the review should be drafted by the committee to enable the appointment and then reviewed in consultation with the person appointed to conduct the review and then brought to Tynwald for approval. At that stage, can Tynwald then change the approval of those terms and conditions? If it seems back to front to me, that should be done before coming to, that should all be sorted before coming to Tynwald. If the Chief Minister can just clarify that for me.
Call on the Honourable Member, Mr Ashford.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Over the last 12 months, I've kept my silence in order to respect the sub judice principle and also show respect to this Honourable Court. Now today, in line with your ruling this morning, I feel I'm in more of a position to speak a bit more freely on this issue. So I do ask your forbearance at the start of my speech. I promise I will get to the contents of the motion eventually. The first thing I want to do, Mr President, is actually echo the Chief Minister's apology to Dr Ranson made in another place last week. The Tribunal has drawn out behaviours and correspondence amongst former senior officers within the Department of Health and Social Care that, to be quite frank, are abhorrent and disgusting. Behaviours which are not acceptable in any organisation at any time, let alone the public service that should hold itself to the highest standards. I wouldn't even describe some of it as behaviour suitable for a children's playground. It went further than that, and some of it was downright malicious. Communication, for instance, emerging between officers effectively joking about the medical director's office provision or lack thereof. As I say, behaviour that is absolutely abhorrent. And I hope that certain individuals will in the future take time to reflect on their behaviour, its inappropriateness and the impact that it's had. Although ministers are not involved in staffing matters or line management, and in fact are specifically under the Government Code prevented from being so involved, I was Minister for the department at the time. People rightly demand political accountability when things go wrong, regardless of whether that politician was directly involved in any of the decision making or not. That's how democracy works, and it's how democracy should work. That is why, on a point of principle, pretty much this time last year, I resigned from government, as I believed it was the right and honourable thing to do, given what emerged from the initial stages of the tribunal. These issues and behaviours amongst senior officers emerged under my watch as Minister, and there's no getting away from that fact, Mr President, and that is why I think it's important for me today to echo the words of the Chief Minister in another place last week. I fully support the Chief Minister's motion today, Mr President, because if any good can come out of this, it's hopefully that it has brought culture and the need for cultural change across the public sector to the fore. There is an old saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and there's been quite rightly and properly a great deal of sunlight poured onto what are ingrained cultural issues across government. We also need to recognise these cultural issues aren't something that just occurred overnight or magically appeared. They are long-established behaviours, some of which I believe have come about due to either an unwillingness to change or an inability to recognise new norms, not just over a few years, but over several decades. In fact, it's something I warned of when I was Minister for the Department of Health and Social Care in this Honourable Court multiple times, precisely because there were issues that needed to be addressed and it was recognised. For those who were here at that time, they will remember the numerous times I raised and was on occasions bluntly honest, both here and in another place, about the cultural issues and challenges within DHSC. Now, it's easy to look back and try and rewrite history, Mr President, and say if there were known cultural issues, why was nothing done about it at the time? In fact, Mr President, actions were taken. The cultural issues was one of the reasons why, as Minister, I brought forward and pushed for the duty of candour requirements within the Manx Care Act to, for the first time in Manx legislation, create a legal responsibility for openness and transparency with individuals and their families when something goes wrong. When you think about it, the fact it took 73 years from the founding of our NHS for that to be spelt out in legislation is in itself remarkable. I also became, as far as I'm aware, the first ever government minister to create a specific delegated department member for culture, precisely because it was recognised at a political level that there were issues that needed to be tackled. It was also one of the things underpinning the Sir Jonathan Michael Review, jointly commissioned by myself and the now Chief Minister when he was Treasury Minister. On page 103, Sir Jonathan clearly identified, and I quote, "There needs to be a change of culture. Frontline staff need to be supported adequately and not be bullied for raising concerns." That is precisely why workforce and culture is one of the main work streams within the healthcare transformation programme and a work stream in its own right. I once described, and I think it was in this Honourable Court, Mr President, DHSC as like an oil tanker, in that you could apply the brakes but it would still travel several miles before coming to a stop. Again, something I've previously said in this Honourable Court is that culture is like a flowing river. It flows right through an organisation from top to bottom, and changing culture is like diverting a river. It takes time, and if done wrongly, can actually cause more problems than you started with. That's why I welcome this review, because we also need to recognise that things and changes need to be done from the centre, ensuring that we have one culture across the whole of government, and dare I use the words, maybe one single legal entity. If anyone inside or outside this Honourable Court thinks issues with culture in government are limited to DHSC, then I hate to tell them, Mr President, but they're deluding themselves. Equally, if people think changing a minister or changing those at the top of a department or organisation is the fix to problems, I'm afraid they're equally deluded. And I can actually, as a point out that during my time as Minister for DHSC, the entire management team actually changed. In fact, we changed CEO twice, and yet these issues still occurred. And also, if people think you change a few HR policies here and there and it's done, they're also deluded. That is the same failed old solutions that have been tried time and time again, and yet here we are today. We need to be honest and recognise cultural change doesn't just take a few months or even a few years. It can, in some circumstances, take a decade or more. And unless we recognise that, alongside recognising that quick fixes don't work, and that while that change embeds itself, other issues may come to light or occur, then nothing will end up changing. Turning specifically to the contents of the motion, Mr President, one of the things I want to focus on is the tribunal process itself. There's been a lot of focus, quite rightly, on the appeals and the reason they were pursued, lengthening the process, which the tribunal classed as an issue in its judgment of the 2nd of May 2023. But one of the things that I think hasn't been fully raised or explored, which any review needs to look at, is why any tribunal was defended at all, and the review and sign-off process that takes place prior to any tribunal proceedings. Assuming there is a formal process where the chances of successfully defending a claim are assessed, as to be honest, despite having been a minister and part of the process, I'm not actually sure if there is one. The disclosure process that, if memory serves me correct, completed in January 2022, clearly drew out damning behaviours and what, to be frank in my view, were outright intimidatory behaviours and belittling of Dr Ranson by other senior officers. So I think the review really needs to look at why, with the evidence revealed as it was at that time, it was felt this tribunal was defendable in the first place, and are the processes we have in place across government strong enough? One of the most important parts of the COVID independent review is that the Chair has the ability at any time during the review, should something emerge, to recommend that the review be expanded, or indeed recommend to Tynwald that a specific area should be subject to a more formal public inquiry. And I would strongly lay down a marker for the committee that we will be appointing, Mr President, that should this motion pass today, that this should also form part of the terms of reference for this review.
Yeah.
Also, one of the other things, and it's following on from the Madam Deputy Speaker's point, Mr President, one of the other reasons that the Code Review was done in partnership with the Public Accounts Committee was the fact that it gave the ability for people to be compelled to actually give evidence, because they could go back to the Public Accounts Committee and, if memory serves me correct, use the Tynwald Proceedings Act to allow people to be compelled to attend. So I do want to ask, will this be the case with this? Is this thinking that if it's appointed by a Tynwald committee, then the same thing can be in place? Because my concern is, with the committee of three, surely when the terms of reference are approved, that committee dissolves. So I'm not sure if that is the same situation. So how would we manage, for instance, if individuals who are within the remit of Manx law decided not to cooperate? Where do we actually stand with that in this review? So, in closing, Mr President, much has been said today and other times about behaviours and culture, and the behaviours that have had light shone upon them over the last year. But I do want to point out, and I think it is important to point out, and it echoes some of the comments already made today, that DHSC and Manx Care is an organisation of around 3,000 individuals. And in an organisation of that size, you will always have issues. And as the Chief Minister stated in another place, we'll never be able to guarantee that issues such as this will not occur again. Now, that's not to detract from these behaviours that were abhorrent and unacceptable in any environment. But it is also important for me to put on record that in my time as Minister for Health and Social Care, Minister for the Treasury, and indeed as a backbench MHK, I can say that 99% of the public servants I've come into contact with have been decent, hard-working, dedicated individuals who put their heart and soul into what they do. No more so than in the Department of Health and Social Care, where we have a large number of employees, doctors, nurses, frontline staff, and indeed back office staff who actually sometimes get quite a bit of stick, going above and beyond, day in, day out, to provide the services on which we all rely. It always concerns me when things such as this happen, it projects badly on the entire public sector when the vast majority of employees are decent individuals working hard at their jobs. Again, that's not to detract from any of the issues that have been identified, but I do think it's important to recognise those individuals who do a good job across the public sector, as I think this has not just hit public confidence, which we have all rightly heard a lot about, but also confidence and morale amongst those who work in our public sector, feeling they are being tarred with the same brush when that shouldn't be the case. So just before resuming my seat, Mr President, I will be fully supporting the motion before us today, but again urge that this review is afforded the same flexibility as the COVID review, in that the independent chair is given sufficient flexibility to be truly independent and not be shackled by any terms of reference constraining them from going wherever the evidence takes them, and also to see if there is a way we can use Tynwald's powers under the Tynwald Proceedings Act to ensure that this review, should someone, and I hope no one would, but should someone decide not to cooperate, they can be compelled to do so. Because I think if we are going to start rebuilding trust in the system, that is something that is needed, and this review needs to be shown that it has teeth. Thank you, Mr President.
Well, on the honourable member, Miss Lord Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. I wasn't in the last administration. For those of you that remember me when I was up on that shelf there will remember that as a member of the Legislative Council, I was not afraid of speaking up and speaking out against the odds. I still take that approach. I think that when you do that, you need to be very, very careful about the implications and the language in this court where that comes to bear. Part of my journey towards standing as a member for the House of Keys was recognising that what was needed in government, in administration, was a reset of approach. And that is why there has been this change where actually things like the COVID review, that has been supported. This motion is recognising that there needs to be an openness to tackling the issues that we're talking about now. But part of me is sitting here just feeling completely bemused because we knew about this stuff in a public way a year ago. We knew about it then, and action has absolutely, it's been taken, so these matters have been taken really, really seriously. There's something else that needs to be pointed out about the use of language in terms of restoring confidence, is that if you're somebody who has been working very hard to get improvements, what you need is the very good, very hard-working people in the public service to come with you and make that change. And honourable members, be under no illusion that cannot be achieved just by people in this court. So I think it is absolutely massively harmful to sort of cast this whole shadow of despair and doubt amongst the positive changes that have been being brought forward, and that good, hard-working public servants are having to push forward and deliver. So it is actually a harmful thing to not only to sort of cast that shadow of a doubt, but actually some of the things that are being said around all of this put at risk seriously undermining the good efforts that are going on to improve things that are very hard to deal with as legacy issues. And we're hearing things, we're acknowledging that a lot of these things have been built up over many, many years. You know, we know that actually the way the system hasn't been working has left us with these issues. So then how are you supposed to approach that at a political level, acknowledging that it is actually the case, and I think that members probably do need to familiarise themselves with the role of ministers and the various HR and whistleblowing processes that are out there, that it's not the case that ministers can involve themselves in personnel matters to the degree that perhaps some people think, but it absolutely is for ministers to see that there are the right processes in place. Which brings me to my next point. So that if we just cast this idea that everything is broken and everything is wrong and everything in the public service and government is rotten, then how do you expect decent people to actually avail themselves of those systems and get behind the changes that are being politically led? How do you expect them to respect the accountability chain that has now been established between the top of government departments and the most senior civil servant? Should that have been done years ago? Yes. Of course it should. Of course it should. But it wasn't. It's there now. It's there now, and that should hopefully give confidence to public service, and it should support ministers better and stop this muddling of ideas between what ministers can do and what actually rightful those people that are employed to manage, to lead, to ensure that processes are carried out positively. That's what that is there for. You know, this has not been a knee-jerk reaction to whistleblowing, the integrity line. That was all established last year, and it was updated to make sure that people knew that that system was there. So whilst for some members this has seemed like a new reaction because we've actually found out of the actual financial cost. Well, we didn't hear all of that, 12 months ago. But in the meantime, this administration has been working to try and fix these things. But my main plea is please don't undermine the positive efforts of the many excellent, hard-working civil servants, which I thank for backing these efforts, for keeping going, actually, when there's been times that have been great difficulty and huge changes in departments, and they're already feeling bashed. So let's respect that. Let's respect the efforts, recognise those efforts, and support each other in that, and everyone can have a role to play in that. So come with us on this journey and support the public service in doing that. And I thank them. I thank them very much. And I hope that they and other people involved in the public service now, in the future, and other politicians involved and being in a position of responsibility to make a difference, to improve things, to keep an eye on these things, can continue on this journey, because it's the only way, and it's the only way to do service to people in the Isle of Man, not to just pursue things for short-term political goals. Thank you, Mr. President.
Call on the honourable member, Mrs. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just initially, just in response to the last speaker, just to remind her that this is the first time honourable members have been able to really debate this topic. So that's why a year later we are...
Honourable member wish to give way?
I will do, yes.
Yeah. Ms Lord Brennan.
There's been 12 months since the changes that government have brought in have been announced. So the discussions about culture, accountability, whistleblowing, all of that stuff, there's been plenty of time for members to take an interest in the root causes and root changes that have led to this. That was my point. Thank you, Mr. President.
Floor, Mrs. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said, this is it's been a year, as she has pointed out, the honourable members pointed out, and this is the first time that we were actually able to debate this publicly, is what I was going to continue in saying. What also does strike me about the last speaker was that, and it does worry me that some honourable members feel that this is an isolated case. And I just want to give you an example of just 2 days ago, I spoke to a public sector worker, not within DHSC, but within another department, who is still too frightened to step forward. So that's why it really does also concern me now.
Does the honourable member wish to give way again to Ms Lord?
Yes, Mr. President.
I haven't indicated at all that this is about one instance. Quite the contrary. It's always been about dealing with this at an organisational level across the public service. I don't think it's helpful for any of us to think about it as a particular instance.
Mrs. Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Moving on, Mr. President, the Ranson versus the Department of Health and Social Care Employment Tribunal has shocked people of this island. And it is truly sad that a shining example of the British medical profession, and I quote from the remedy decision on paragraph 14, was subjected to humiliation, bullying, harassment and vilification, and dismissed after she raised a number of serious concerns. Honourable members, there are plenty of further references to humiliation in the liability decision, in paragraphs 630, 649, 731, 733, 738, 739 and 746. Mr. President, I speak for those that have reached out to me, my constituents and the wider public. The people of this island want to know the truth. The people of this island demand transparency, and they will be judging the decisions we make today if we are fit for public office. Mr. President, why is an independent inquiry into the management of the Isle of Man, government of the Ranson and the DHSC Tribunal and associated High Court proceedings so important? Because Dr Ranson was awarded sums for aggravated and exemplary damages, both of which are exceptionally rare. Paragraph 185 of the remedy hearing describes these awards were made due to the DHSC's high-handed, malicious, insulting and oppressive manner during the course of the litigation, and were warranted for oppressive, arbitrary and unconstitutional behaviour amounting to gross misconduct. And yet, it is this government's own admission that they have taken action to make meaningful change. But I find it hard to believe that the culture is changing at the pace that we need it to when I read these words from a remedy decision just on the 5th of May. So why is this independent inquiry so important? Because when you say something is going to change, quite simply, we put our trust in you that it will. And when we see clear evidence that it hasn't changed, then quite simply, that trust is now gone. And you have lost the trust of the people in resolving this. And making that change and further wrongdoings have been allowed to happen to Dr Ranson throughout this last year. Why is this independent inquiry so important? Because if we are to rid ourselves of this bad culture and pave the way for future whistleblowers to have the confidence that they can come forward and that their careers will not be ruined, this government must open up and admit our failings. Why is this independent inquiry so important? Because if this behaviour is allowed to go unquestioned, this toxic culture will continue to damage the reputation of this government and the island. Why is this independent inquiry so important? Because quite simply, we cannot afford for more tribunals to be dealt with in such a way at the taxpayer's expense. I have literally gone from meeting to meeting with members of the public and, dare I say, civil servants who can think of numerous ways 3.2 million could be better spent. There is no shadow of a doubt that I agree with paragraph 363 of the remedy decision. DHSC fought tooth and nail on a false basis to the substantial detriment of Dr Ranson and at the expense of taxpayers on the Isle of Man.
Mr President, point of order, that is actually a misquote from the Tribunal Remedy Decision, paragraph 363. The Tribunal actually stated the case on liability was fought tooth and nail by the DHSC. And I think it is very important that we make that point clear. There's a lot of debate going on here around toxic culture and around things needing to have changed. The point that I tried to make in my statement repeatedly was that things have changed significantly. The Tribunal themselves acknowledged that in their remedy judgment, being very clear as to where the issues lay, and that the issues lay around the liability case and the liability judgment, not subsequently. And that is a very important point that needs to be made, and I would appreciate if members are going to quote from the public record that they do so accurately.
Question at the floor.
Thank you, Mr President. And thank you to the Honourable Member. I obviously will need to just clarify that, those comments, but I take that back if I've misrepresented that. So I move on.
Please do.
Thank you, Mr President. Why is this independent inquiry so important? Because as the King pledged in the coronation that he comes not to be served but to serve, and we must do the same. Mr President, should this motion be successful today, we will then be tasked with nominating members of Tynwald who should serve on the committee to appoint a retired High Court judge or King's Counsel to undertake this review, and as there are no standing orders to tell us who is eligible, this is therefore a matter of political judgment. I urge members to think carefully that if this investigation is to have any chance of credibility and build public trust, and public trust in Tynwald, that it is my opinion that no member past or present of the Council of Ministers should be selected for this committee. No member past or present of the DHSC should be selected for this committee.
It's just about conflicts.
No member past or present of the Cabinet Office should be selected for this committee. That does leave a small pool of members to choose from, but that should make it easy for members to make a quick decision knowing that they have done everything they can to secure the credibility of the independence review. There is more to be done. There is more listening to be done, and there is more serving to be done. The terms of reference will be the next time we must face the same public scrutiny. And while this is in progress, I call on the Council of Ministers to display humility and patience. There are speakers that have spoken today and have been very brave too. When you are speaking in the public or Parliament, you need to be more transparent than ever. From the top down, this affects every civil servant in their day-to-day jobs. Every time our colleagues speak to a member of the public, they will be faced with doubt, distrust and scepticism, making their jobs very much harder, making their jobs less efficient. This culture change has to start from the top. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, members, before we move on to the next speaker, I'd just like to remind you of Standing Order 3.301. No member may use the name of the Sovereign or the Governor irreverently or for the purpose of influencing Tynwald in its deliberations. I now call upon the Honourable Member, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. Firstly, I'd like to say I have a pre-declared position on whistleblowing since being elected, and which I did declare on being appointed to my current role. Whistleblowing and the protection of whistleblowers was one of the major issues I wanted to address when elected in 2016. Whistleblowers are an important part of any democracy and any organisation. They are the people at the coalface protecting the interests of the Manx people who fund and use all of our services. The protection of whistleblowers in public service is vital if we want proper governance to be upheld in all public services and utilities. They are providing the services for our public. We have had a poor record of how whistleblowers are treated when they raise serious issues. But these are issues raised in all of our interests. As the proposer and chair of the Whistleblowing Committee myself, I heard some appalling accounts of the treatment of those whistleblowers, some too frightened to walk into the committee, and some seeking anonymity for fear of reprisal. For speaking up in all of our interests about health and safety issues, financial mismanagement, cronyism, undue favouritism, incompetence and conduct that was costing us all. Whistleblowers still come to me from all areas of government. We have to speak up for them and for those who have spoken up for the public and who have lost their careers, health, or have had their jobs made more difficult or threatened into silence. I have received many shocking and upsetting emails in the last few days detailing mistreatment of whistleblowers. On reading judgments, you cannot fail to see a familiar pattern, not only in the patterns of behaviours experienced by the whistleblower, but then follow-on tactics used against a whistleblower. Most of the successful cases have been largely kept low-key. Thankfully, the Dr Ranson case and her legal representation has brought it into the spotlight. Some actions show a sheer contempt for policies and processes that we as a government implement and oversee. We and the people who are employed by this government have a duty to adhere to policy, procedure and regulations that underpin the good governance of this island. If there's a failure, we all fail. So when we say it's nothing to do with me, as politicians do say, it is a failure to comply with those policies and legal process that we are here to uphold. Familiar to many of these cases are the attempts by the whistleblower to try and resolve the matter. Usually, as a last resort, they approach their MHKs in a desperate attempt for someone to listen, for someone to step in, believing that someone will apply some common sense, some good governance will be applied. But in Dr Ranson's case, to no avail. Elected representatives turning a blind eye achieves one thing and one thing only. It adds power and strength to anything that is seen as perpetrator and gives a green light for them to continue with their behaviours. As these cases progress, the whistleblower sees signs of closing ranks and experiences the frustration that no one will step in to admit to failings. We need to start doing this at the very first opportunity. Our duty as an MHK, elected by the people, is to ensure policy and procedure is adhered to and applied. A whistleblower raising a concern in the public interest and being victimised is most definitely all of our concerns. The culture within government starts from the top, the very top. If we continue to ignore what's going on before our eyes, services to society will not improve. That is this Honourable Court, Tynwald. Only we as elected members have the power to address this. We need to fully accept that responsibility and act to get rid of the described toxic culture in Isle of Man government. We need to support those who speak out in public office and those who are committed to doing the right thing, and that they're treated with the respect that they deserve. Our public service has lost so many experienced people due to the culture. We, as elected politicians, are put here by the public to look after the public interest, and we must act to do everything in our power to address this. Managers, senior managers, directors, chief officers, we all need, and politicians, we all need to be held to account. Complacency to turn a blind eye, saying, oh, it's operational, it's nothing to do with me as a politician. Well, I'm sorry, it has everything to do with all of us. Sorry, Mr. President, I am missing some bits out. I just want to reiterate that the tribunal ruled that Dr Ranson had been subjected to humiliation, bullying, harassment and vilification, and that her humiliation was apparent up to and including high levels of government and the Council of Ministers. The case raised many questions about our governance, and many questions arise on who authorises the pursuit of these cases, which is covered by this motion today by the Chief Minister. That is what this motion is going to address. Politicians need to fully support their departments on all of these matters. The members in here that are in departments need to make sure that policy, procedure and process is being adhered to. And if not, it's up to us as the leaders in them departments to ensure that the officers have the freedom and the support to implement policy and have it adhered to. We can't ignore anything. We cannot cover anything up. This needs to be ingrained in all of our consciences, as it has far-reaching damage, not only for the people subjected to the behaviour, but to the public trust and the cost to the taxpayer of the island. The island is a very special place to live and work. Mr. President, I worked as a public servant for 38 years before coming into politics. I worked in an excellent public service with many, many excellent members serving the public, officers at all levels, frontline staff. Many of them are still here today, and they deserve the thanks for sticking with it and working hard for the people of the island. Certainly, the culture within the DHSC or to continue into Manx Care, we need to make sure that the Manx Care Board are held to account and are adhering to all of our policies and procedures, and that includes officers who are employed by Manx Care as well. This should not be a witch hunt for which officers done wrong and which officers might have been involved here or there. Politicians should be held to account, totally agree, but our officers are there to deliver the policy, and Island Plan is the key document that this government has passed quite recently, and they are there to adhere to the government of the day's policy and ensure that that's implemented for the best for the people of the island. And we need to respect that they are doing the job to the best of their ability. And if they do need support and help, we need to ensure that the appropriate training on policy is in place for them and that the managers can manage these situations in the workplace. I have to admit that, and I have this conversation quite often, that the training I had when I come into Isle of Man government that I was proud to be part of was absolutely outstanding. It was better than you could get anywhere. So therefore, you understood how to deal with people. You had to have management qualifications and skills to be able to manage people. You didn't get promoted to manage people if you didn't have those qualifications. So we need to ensure, all of us in here, that we've got the right processes in place to ensure, because that we've got that excellence in governance across the island. Because certainly we've lost so many well-qualified, experienced staff, and we shouldn't have. The issues are far-reaching, and the consequences and the damage goes deep into the roots of our democracy, from us elected by the public to represent them. It also highlights the fact, in a spectacular way, that all of us in here, and I'm going to say again, including our arm's length parts of government, have to be held to account, as it's taxpayers' money, and they need to be looked at. All of this needs to be looked at as a matter of urgency to ensure that any contract that is in place, that the individual can be held to account for the taxpayer of the Isle of Man if there is a need. But I would hope that we don't get to that position in the first place. We do need to continue with the progress that has been made from the Whistleblown Committee's recommendations, and that is to make sure the employment legislation is updated and brought to this court as soon as possible. We do, I feel, need to look at, and I'm sure the consultation process will probably have this in it, because it's certainly been addressed to me, that we have to have laws in place that can deal with misconduct in public office. And MHKs cannot sit on their hands and do nothing here neither. We're here to act on behalf of the people of the island. If anybody wants to challenge me on any of the facts that I've said today, you're very welcome to, because I've been in the system too long and know too many individuals who have suffered at the hands of bullies, and it starts right at the top in here at Tynwald. We've probably all come into politics to ensure that there's no wrongdoing and that we're doing the right for the people of the island. There's excellent policies and procedures in place for every public sector employee, and politicians need to be able to understand those as well and act in accordance with them. Some of the structures and process that are in place when dealing with employment matters, clearly, honourable members, we're not employed, but we do need to make sure that we bring anything to people's attention. And I can confirm that in the past administration, not this one, I was ridiculed and bullied when trying to inform of wrongdoing. And that made me dig my heels in and make sure that that whistleblowing committee succeeded in putting recommendations forward to this court. In February 2021, this Honourable Court agreed with the recommendations of the committee or the amendments that went through. And we need to all remember that we have been on this journey. The current Chief Minister, and, you know, the public might say, oh, she wants to hang on to a job. I want to do the right job. I don't want to hang on to my job. I'm in here to do the right job. But I can confirm to everybody in here, have I seen a Chief Minister that's listening? Have I seen a Chief Minister that is implementing the policy and recommendations of a whistleblowing committee? Yes, I have. Had I seen that previously? No, I hadn't. It was ridicule, what do they know, attitude. That's certainly not what I'm seeing from this Chief Minister and this Council of Ministers. I don't want to hang on to my job for the wrong reasons. I want to hang on to it for the right reasons. And I'm confident that if this motion goes through today, that we will see the progress that the people of the Isle of Man want to see, but all honourable members in here wish to see as well. And without moving forward on this and making sure we've got that independence of a high-class judge doing this, we won't get there. And I'm delighted to say that the recommendation is that the review is laid before Tynwald in December 2023. There's a lot of work needs to be done in that time, and I'm quite certain that that report will come back and help support all honourable members in here, see that they have to have a part in this, but you also vote on this when it comes forward. And any recommendations we're all part of, and any that have gone before us we've been part of, and we need to make sure they're adhered to. And the Chief Minister is doing his utmost best to make sure that that is the case. Thank you, Mr. President.
Call on the Honourable Member, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll keep this much shorter and sweeter. I welcome this motion today to set up the Select Committee and to have an inquiry into the remaining matters around this. I'd like to make the comment, as so many people have done today, that culture change is hard. I've had the privilege of working with many, many excellent civil servants whom I have the greatest respect for, and I know that this continuing discussion and debate is still having an impact on civil servants. We need not to rely necessarily on formal mechanisms for concerns to be raised. As politicians and working within government departments, if we are part of government to do so, it is beholden on all of us to accept those comments and recommendations in whatever form they come and to take action to do that. And so the leadership for this culture change does come from this House. I think it is already in train with many of the current members of this administration, and I welcome this inquiry to drive that forward.
Call on the Honourable Member, Mr Henderson.
I stand to support the Chief Minister's initiative, which I've got no problem at all with, and I think it's the correct direction to take an inquiry such as this. My feelings with regards to a Tynwald Select Committee trying to handle something like this are that perhaps it's almost out of the Tynwald Select Committee's professional ability to go that far and to the depth that we require. We do require somebody who has got a legal investigative knowledge and experience, and I would ask the Chief Minister if support is needed for the inquiry, should this motion be successful, that the Chair can actually ask for that additional support and resource, because for me to undertake such an inquiry just isn't about one individual sending a few letters out and collecting responses or trawling the internet. This is going to have to be a proper, professional, in-depth investigation into what is and what isn't, to determine outcomes and to have quality outcomes as well. and to collect the data that's required to inform those decisions. I've got no doubt about that. Dr. N, I've listened to all the contributors this morning, and I've listened to the Health Minister's statement that he gave, and I have to say a lot of issues that have been raised this morning have resonated with me, and like the Honourable Member for Onken Misedge, I too have served in government for nearly as many years within in the health sector, as everyone knows, and nearly as many years again in this honourable place. So I've seen both sides of the fence. And one of the things that pushed me into joining a trade union or staff side organisation was the fact of cultural issues within the health service, and in particular in isolated spots where there was clear bullying and manipulation of staff going on. No question about it. And that caused me to become a union representative, or one element that pushed me into going for that role. I have to also say, Dr. N, that in identifying that aspect, as another honourable member has said, 99% of staff I've ever come across within government are excellent, hard-working people. And I want that on record. But unfortunately, like any larger organisation, government or private, you will always get somebody who will subvert the rules or exhibit behaviour to meet their own ends. And that's as true in our organisation as anywhere else. And unfortunately, something has happened here, and I will pinpoint individuals, not by names, but individuals have been highlighted in the tribunal documentation quite clearly. And I would say to the Honourable Court, Dr. N, that those individuals identified are highly trained in management, presumably have qualifications, and they have HR experience and qualifications, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They know what the HR policy and procedures are, they know what good staff management is, they know how to conflict manage, they know how to resolution management. They know all that. It's part of their basic training. It's not additional. And I've gone on, Dr. N, ad nauseum in here from time to time when we have similar issues that have produced reports, and it always comes back to systems, processes, procedures. And what every single time we fail to address is the fact that we're looking at a capability issue. A human capability issue has been the pinch point that has caused the issue. Or one or two or three or four people, unfortunately. People are not perfect and can't function 100% to the policies we want all the time. There's always an element of human error somewhere at some point in time. It's inevitable. But the point I'm making, Dr. N, is that all the reports I've seen across the decks here, certainly 80% of the time, point at policy and procedure process. They do not address a clear capability issue that's failed to be acted upon in the first place, or a quality issue, which is a staffing issue. And that's where we're missing the ticket here. We're all going down the route of let's have a look at the politicians, we're supposed to lead. Yes, we are. But at the level we're talking about, there's a break or a glass ceiling at times, and the Honourable Member for Onken Misedge is right again. If we're aware of something, we shouldn't say, oh, there's a glass ceiling there. We need to bring that to the attention of whoever needs it to be brought to. But nonetheless, we're missing the trick there, and that needs to be addressed. And HR policies need to be completely highlighted throughout the organisation, down to sectional leaders if necessary. I've still got evidence of it now. Again, as I say, 99% of our staff are great. But why am I getting reports where duty rotas are hidden in management's office, so staff on an evening shift don't know where they're working the next day, and they're not allowed to access those duty rotas, for instance? What's that all about? It's about control and power. And when we appoint people to management positions, we've got to ensure that A, they are experienced and or get the training, and especially in HR. And then we need to quality check from time to time that HR policies are being adhered to. What's happened here, I'm quite astonished, to be quite honest, Dr N, as to the findings of the tribunal, but nonetheless the Chief Minister is now, hopefully his investigation will be launched and we can get into this and find out what does need to be changed or improved upon. It's a very serious matter, Dr N. As to regards the impact it's all having, I have to agree with the Honourable Member, Minister Lord Brennan, on that, because it is casting a shadow over everything at the minute, and that needs to be pushed to one side, and we need to be clear in what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we're not just aiming at all staff, because most all staff are really good, and we've got some high quality people there. But as with all these things, the other danger is that we always complain about the speed of decision making and how things are done in this place or throughout sections of government. The more transparent you become and the more policies and procedures that are in place, the slower the machinery becomes. So you need to be aware of that as well, honourable members, really. There has to be a balance in here when we're going down these routes, because it will make people more cautious, more wary, looking over the shoulder, afraid of comeback, not wanting to make a decision. It will get pushed upstairs, as in inverted commas, for somebody higher up to take that decision when that person could be perfectly able to. They might be very cautious of making a decision as a result of all this. So that needs to be carefully considered, Dr N. I think those are my main points, Dr N, but I would ask the Court to seriously consider the Chief Minister's proposal this morning and support it.
Call on the Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I wish to make a couple of general points. First and foremost, some honourable members who have spoken this morning in terms of, eloquently spoken, I think, in terms of highlighting this proposal will not solve all the problems, are absolutely right. I made it absolutely clear at the beginning of all this last week and in my speech today that there are multi-strands of this. That Kate Brunner's KC inquiry COVID review has a role to play in this, particularly when it comes to dealing with some of the language that has been used about saving lives and the position of responsibility that Dr Ranson, in her role as medical director, held, and of course the methods and ways in which communication was not or was being passed to the Council of Ministers. All that needs to be established, and there is a mechanism to do so. The second element, of course, is this inquiry, proposed inquiry, which I shall come to in a second. But of course, the third element, as referred to by many speakers, but particularly by the Education Minister this morning, was this responsibility on all of us to continue to ensure and to strive for excellence in governance and excellence in performance. And I set out 12 months ago how we were going to do that. But of course, things do not turn overnight. It takes a long, protracted effort to ensure that culture changes, that performance management changes, and that people continually are aware of the need for proper professional behaviours, but are also aware of how they go about reporting ineffective, inefficient or wrong behaviours in the public service. And I believe that the integrity line and other mechanisms open to whistleblowers are absolutely vital, and of course we must continue to ensure and respect those processes and ensure that people can safely and securely come and report their concerns and those concerns be dealt with. And that is incumbent on all of us to do that, and I congratulate everybody who is standing up to that fact and is taking that forward and acknowledges that they have to be part of the solution, and that we can only achieve that by working together, both as politicians but also working together with our workforce and with our staff. I'm confident that the proposals that I've set out will help change the way in which the public sector approaches performance management. I would encourage everybody to be aware of those proposals. I will come forward with more proposals about how we help improve that in terms of the support given particularly to senior managers via the Office of Human Resources, and there is a lot of work still to do. Of course, this particular motion today does deal with some of the concerns, significant concerns that have been raised. I want to deal first of all with a couple of administrative points. In bringing forward this motion, I did not see it as this select committee was set up simply to appoint and then to collapse. There may well be communication needed between the individual who is conducting the review and the committee. So my view is that committee stays in place under the eventual terms of reference that are approved at a later date, I hope not too later a date, by this honourable court. And of course, ultimately, this court will need to be presented with and debate the findings from any such person. So that committee should stay in place. Mr. Crookall and others, I think, asked about evidence. I think this proposal that you have in front of you today asks that the committee work with any appointee to determine how the inquiry should be conducted. I note, of course, the terms of reference that have been given to Kate Brunner, which allows her to make a judgment call as to whether any parts of the evidence she is receiving should be heard in public, and I would suggest that this judgment is made by the individual concerned in conjunction with the Select Committee, and that we see the outcome of that when they come forward to present those terms of reference. Of course, the full public inquiries position is very expensive, but of course does require everybody to give evidence in public, and there may be people who wish to give evidence confidentially to an individual. So I think, Mr. President, my view in response to the Honourable Member, both in terms of the longevity of the committee and of course the specifics, though, about how the High Court judge or whoever is appointed exercises their power should be a point of discussion. And of course the other point that I think has been drawn out, Mr. Henderson mentioned the knowledge base, perhaps, or rather perhaps more importantly the technicalities, the legal technicalities that have been involved around subjudice, legal privilege. I think that in appointing and recommending that it is a High Court judge or KC or person of similar standing, that they will have a good grasp of that and will be able to work with the committee to properly understand how those matters should be dealt with, and therefore drawing up a terms of reference before appointing somebody, or a hard terms of reference. We've outlined what we think should be some of the substance of that terms of reference, but the committee themselves and the High Court judge or whoever is appointed should then be able to work further to cement that in an appropriate manner, given the expertise of the type of individual that we are seeking to appoint. I hope, to Tynwald and the Select Committee, are hoping to appoint to this role. And then finally, there was this issue around proceedings and calling of witnesses. And again, I think that needs to be discussed. Ideally, of course, a public inquiry would achieve that objective. I would actually like to just ask the Attorney-General for an overview to the Honourable Court about how one would seek to enforce an individual appearing before an inquiry were they not located in the Isle of Man and subjected to Manx law, because that question has been put to me and I seek an advice on that matter from the Attorney-General.
Mr. Attorney.
Thank you, sir. Honourable members, the Tynwald Proceedings Act 1876 enables a Tynwald committee to summons a witness to appear. And the legislation further provides that such attendance can be enforced in the same way as persons can be summoned to appear before a court of law. But it's important to remember that to be effective, a summons requires to have been personally served upon a prospective witness. Without personal service, the summons cannot be enforced. Conversely, once served, it is a contempt of court for a witness to regard that summons. Contempt is an offence which can be punished and attendance before a Tynwald committee compelled by the committee imposing a fine, or in drastic cases imprisonment is an option. A witness can be presented, certainly in court, and therefore to the committee, in other words, arrested and presented. But the key to what I've said, and I think the point which the Chief Minister might have in mind, is that everything I've said about being able to enforce a witness to attend before a select committee relies upon personal service. And where one is considering compelling the attendance of a non-resident, someone who's never perhaps going to visit the island again, there are practical difficulties which in reality means that their attendance cannot be enforced.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney, for that. Having said that and heard that, and clearly recognising, I expect that the target of that question is the individual who no longer resides on the island and was heavily and substantially involved in this particular case, I would also suggest that there is likely to be substantial evidence for any High Court judge, KC or person of similar standing to be able to make an appropriate, or take an appropriate view and make any recommendations around further action or subsequent recommendations as appropriate to this Honourable Court. Mr. President, having heard some of the contributions this morning, I am now more than ever convinced that this inquiry and review must now take place in order to properly and substantially address some of those very serious concerns and some of the language that has been used. It is clear from some of the language this morning, which I completely reject, that there is an allegation that somehow senior members of government have continued, above and beyond what was identified in the liability judgment, to conspire to directly harm Dr Ranson. This is a very serious matter and must be properly addressed, and I expect those people who have used that language to give full and proper evidence to a High Court judge of their allegations, and subsequently to consider what their reaction may be following any particular outcomes. It is deeply regrettable, I believe, that allegations from Mr Glover, the full power of the state, from Mr Wonnacott, that the government machine has been vindictive and permitted a savage and out for revenge system, have been stated today. It lays open the integrity of everybody serving at the highest levels. And my personal experience of this administration is that ministers, senior government officials and others have done nothing else but tried and sought to conduct themselves properly and entirely respectfully in their positions, throughout both the course of this tribunal, but also in terms of seeking to achieve better outcomes for the people of this island. And those outcomes have been clearly and concisely laid out in our island plan, in which we have set the clear objectives, we think, for a better island, a stronger island, a more sustainable island. And Mr. President, when an individual like Mr. Glover calls for the police to come in, then he needs to carefully consider what evidence he believes he has for that call, and I expect him to give his full and complete evidence to a High Court judge when he makes such statements. And whilst he goes off to the back benches, the rest of us are going to carry on trying to make a difference and trying to work with people to create a better public service and achieve better outcomes for the people of this island. Mrs. Kane talks about the need to restore public confidence, and I agree with her that this matter has now reached a point where there have been so much substantial allegations made and inferences made that we must now seek to do that. I believe this tribunal will do that in one part. But as I pointed out right at the very beginning, there are many, many other elements for us to work on to achieve better outcomes for so many people. There are so many good people in the public service doing such a good job. But there are at times, unfortunately, incidences that occur that need addressing. And Mr. President, as I said last week, I don't believe that with the best will in the world that we will ever move from a position where from time to time there will not be cases that may cause concern. What we are trying to do and what we must do is work to improve the environment for everybody, provide clear leadership, ensure that whistleblowers are properly respected, that they have the right access, that the processes are there, that they're treated with respect. But of course, in a staff of 7,500 or so full-time equivalents, there will always be occasions where individuals may perceive or believe that they have a case that needs answering. And the truth of the matter is that is not always substantiated by the facts, and that there will always be disgruntlement, I suspect, in and around the environment. Our job is to ensure that the processes, performance management, and of course the manner absolutely in which people are treated is properly documented and professionally managed, and that people are treated with respect. And, Mr. President, of course, that does start at the top, and particularly how people treat and talk about these matters in this honourable court. But yes, this will go a substantial way to helping to restore public confidence, and I very much hope that once the Select Committee gets to work, if this is supported, that a person of substantial standing will be found to conduct the inquiry. I think I've addressed the technical points really that Mr. Crookall sought to make, and obviously acknowledged the statement from the former Minister, and of course support the view that came from him. I think that we must always continue to strive to make the public service a better place, and that many issues have been going on for a long time. And I think, when I first came into politics in 2011, and through the next 4 or 5 years, it very much was the case that there were significant issues that needed addressing in terms of health and safety, particularly in the hospital. That's why we had a substantial period of West Midlands reviews, where some of the attached issues that we've been discussing today were sought to be rectified, and of course why ultimately he and I led what we believe was a reform process needed for us to start to move, or to put in place the foundations to move to a better position. I thank the Minister for the Cabinet Office and also Chair of the Public Service Commission for her statement and her support for senior officers and indeed all staff across the public sector who are striving to do the very best that they can. Mrs. Christian effectively quoted very much what I quoted in my statement to start off proceedings this morning, and really I think sought to enforce what the tribunal said about the sad state of affairs that were identified around the delivery of evidence, particularly in the early stages of the liability hearing, around the disclosure of evidence and the manner in which that liability evidence was handled and treated in terms of its approach to the tribunal. Clearly stated, that element needs proper focus and investigation. I've talked already about the Education Minister's contribution, and indeed thank Mrs Hayward and Mr Henderson for theirs. Mr President, this is not the end of matters. As I said, we have a clear strategic approach to this now, but this will deal, and very importantly deal, with matters that have been raised that are of significant public concern. I hope that if supported, and I urge honourable members to support this review, it can be conducted as efficiently and effectively as possible. But meanwhile, our job goes on. We need to lead a public service that is on a pathway of improvement and that is setting out to deliver a better future, a better island, better course of public services for all our people across the island. And I support those 100% who are setting out today to do that.
Now, honourable members, we come to vote on this item. Chief Minister's motion of public importance. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no.
No.
Divide.
Division called.
Mr President, it's 22 votes for in the Keys and 1 against.
Legislative Council, 9 for, none against. Therefore, motion carried. Now, honourable members, you've decided to appoint a select committee of 3 members. I therefore call for nominations. Miss August Hanson?
I'd like to nominate Sarah Maltby.
Nomination, Mrs Maltby.
Mr President, I'd like to nominate Mrs Kinnish, Honourable Member for Council.
Mr Callister.
Thank you, Mr President. I beg to nominate my colleague from Douglas South, Mrs Christian.
Mrs Maltby.
I second Mrs Kinnish, please.
Mrs Christian. Your nomination?
Yes, I'd like to nominate the Honourable Deputy Speaker. Thank you.
Mrs Kane. Mr Lord Brennan.
Second Mrs Kane.
Mr Wannenberg.
Thank you, Mr President. I second Mrs Christian.
Sorry, you second Mrs Christian? Oh, thank you. Mrs Edge?
I'd like to nominate another member from Legislative Council, Mrs Shop.
Mrs Barber?
Has Mrs Maltby been seconded?
Mrs Maltby has not been seconded.
I'll second Mrs Maltby.
Thank you. No more nominations, honourable members. Any more? Is there any that are not? Would I ask the clerk to read out who has been nominated and seconded at this stage?
Thank you, Mr President. The members who have been nominated and seconded are Mrs Kane, Mrs Christian, Mrs Kinnish and Mrs Maltby.
4 members that have been nominated and seconded. Therefore, we will call the vote. So I'll call on the clerk to run the vote. Mrs Kinnish, sorry. Sorry, would you? Yeah, did you wish to second anyone?
No, it's not a nomination. I'm able to speak before the vote.
if you think you may be any relevant issue to being on the committee?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll allow that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to be completely open and transparent with this court. During the period prior to the tribunal for Dr Ranson, an investigation was carried out. That investigation did cease because the original investigator was conflicted. I was then contacted by the Office of Human Resources as an independent person to carry out a fresh investigation. That request was not done until quite late, in fact just a couple of months before the tribunal was due to be heard in the January. I received a copy of the terms of reference from the designated manager, reviewed those and determined that I would attempt to start the investigation. However, I did caveat that to the designated manager and made them aware that it was unlikely that there would be much engagement for the investigation because of the close proximity to that tribunal. However, I did contact Dr Ranson and I did contact Mrs Magson. Dr Ranson did report back to me very timely and she advised that they were at the point of disclosure and once she had disclosure she would consider whether she would engage with a subsequent investigation. Has to be borne in mind by members, by this stage lots of people had been interviewed and the situation must have been quite stressful already for those people. Mrs Magson, however, did not reply to my email, which would have then made it very difficult to have formed opinions on the basis of interviews, and I would have had to have relied on documentation, which to undertake that in a very short period would have been difficult. It was then determined, having discussed with the designated manager, that this investigation would not continue. But I feel in order for transparency in this court, I wish that to be known to members here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
President, point of order. I mean, obviously, having heard that, can I ask that nominations be reopened, given that one member has been nominated and has now effectively declared potentially a conflict of interest?
I'm content to open up. We did have several nominations, I think, that were proposed but not seconded. Can we remind ourselves of that?
Mr. President, the only member who's been proposed but not seconded is Mrs. Sharp.
Mrs. Sharp, okay. And Miss Edge?
Can I nominate Mrs. Corlett?
Mrs. Kane?
Mrs. Sharp,
A second for Mrs. Sharp.
Can I nominate Mr. Mercer?
Nomination for Mr. Mercer.
Happy to second Mr. Mercer.
Seconded there for Mr. Mercer. Mrs. Maltby.
I nominate Mr. Peters, please.
Nomination for Mr. Peters. Mr. Collister.
Happy to second that, Mr. President.
We'll now close the nominations, honourable members, and ask the clerk to run the vote. And as I do that, just remind members that you have 3 votes, and you must vote 3 and no to the rest. If you do not vote exactly for 3, your paper will be spoiled, therefore your votes will not be counted.
Mr. President, can we just be reminded of the list of candidates?
We
please?
can indeed, once the clerk has it all together.
Mr. President, the members who have now been nominated and seconded are Mrs. Kane, Mrs. Christian, Mrs. Kinnish, Mrs. Maltby, Mr. Mercer, Mr. Peters, and Mrs. Sharp.
So, honourable members, you have 3 votes.
Point of order. Was Mrs. Sharp seconded?
Yes, she was.
Oh, she was.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Ranson. Mrs. Kinnish. Do you press the button?
Sorry.
Sometimes when you press it, it takes a few moments for the machine to register your vote. Honourable members, we have 2 members voted onto the committee, Mrs. Kane and Mrs. Maltby, 27 and 20 votes respectively. We will now run the vote again, and we'll drop off the last 2, Mrs. Sharp and Mrs. Kinnish. Mr. President, just as a reminder, there's now 1 vacancy and 3 candidates. And the 3 candidates are Mrs. Christian, Mr. Mercer and Mr. Peters. Members,
sorry.
We have Mrs. Christian with 11 votes.
President. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button in that last one.
So can we reverse that? Can I ask the clerk? Vote again. Well, I think, Mr. President, to be honest, it doesn't change the result. You can decide to record a different vote for Mrs. Christian if she wants to tell the court who she meant to vote for. Yeah. Clearly, we need to run a vote again, and I will suggest we run the same 3 one more time, since there's a tie for the second and last place. Please reconsider your votes, honourable members. To remind you, are voting for 1 member now on this committee.
Honourable members, we have Mrs Christian with 13, Mr Peters with 10, and Mr Mercer with 9. We'll therefore drop Mr Mercer and now run the vote for Mrs Christian and Mr Peters. Result, Mr Peters is duly elected onto that committee.